My name is Warwick Powell, and I'll be your host today, where we bring to you a conversation with a former Australian diplomat and senior government advisor, David Morris. The program seeks to amplify voices from the Asia region around issues that affect the world, particularly in terms of how they affect us here in the Asia Pacific region. David is, apart from being a former government official, is a senior research fellow with the Beijing Foreign Studies University, a senior fellow at the Centre for China and Globalization. He's also a visiting professor at the Catholic University of Vendée in France, and recently he's been appointed the Chief Executive Officer of the Australia-China Business Council in the state of Tasmania in Australia, which has seen the revitalisation of this important organisation. Needless to say, David is speaking to us in his own capacity. In this capacity, he's speaking to us because he's also the author of a recent book. And the book deals with the changing dynamics of the global world and the risks that we currently face and the prospects of finding new ways of resolving global differences and achieving diplomatic outcomes that take humanity forward. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, David.
Hello, Warwick. It's good to be here.
Well, it's great to hear an Australian voice, and I hope our viewers will find a double-barrel Australian accent endearing. As I mentioned, you've recently published a book. Perhaps you could give us a bit of an overview as to what the book's about and what your principal conclusions are.
Sure. Look, I'm happy to do that, Warwick. I set out on a journey a few years ago now to try and bring my experience and some original thinking to what is going on in the world. I think we're all a little bit confused about the complexity and the speed of the change that's happening in the world order. I had been, as you mentioned, I had been a former diplomat and senior government official, and I found myself in Beijing, serving in Beijing as a diplomat, but not for Australia. I was working for the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, which is the regional organisation for the Pacific Islands region, or the Oceania region, and I was working to strengthen those relationships, those economic relationships in particular between China and the Pacific at the very time of the big change in global geopolitics, when Donald Trump was elected, when the first trade war began, when there was a lot of tension in the bilateral relationship as well between Australia and China. And so I thought, well, given the experience I'd had over decades of working either in government or with business or with universities, and I'd had an experience where I could see that between China and the world, there were often many misunderstandings, the huge cultural differences between the West and the East. And I thought that I wanted to understand in a more academic way than I had ever had the opportunity to do what was going on. So I undertook a PhD. I read as much as I could. I attended as many conferences as I could, and continued my conference going with business leaders, but also had the chance to interview a lot of people in academia and across all kinds of different walks of life to try and understand what's going on with China's increasing role in the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its international activities in finance, in its innovation in technology, and all of those things that are starting to cause some concern in the United States and concern in some other Western countries, and are causing some tensions. I wanted to understand it from an original perspective. And so my original take on this, which these days it's a word that's used a lot, but when I started on my journey, I came up with the idea of looking at these questions from a risk perspective. It seemed to me that talk of threat was overblown. It seemed to me that from my experience of decades of working with China, I couldn't see hard threats. I couldn't see serious threats in the short term. I can, of course, see that bad decision making in any country can always generate threats in the medium or long term. But what I could see was that through misunderstandings and through differences in approach, that no doubt we are going to face a whole series of risks in the future in the international economy and in the geopolitical system, the world order system, as we call it. We're obviously heading into a period of risks, and the neat thing about risk is that risk usually can be managed. We all know that we face risks every day in our day-to-day lives. When you drive a car across the street, you are facing risks, but we learn how to manage them. And so this was my approach, was to try and figure out, well, what are the big risks? What are the risks in finance? What are the risks in technology? What are the risks in hard infrastructure projects, ports, and things like that are often talked about as evoking threats? How could we actually manage the risks of a much more powerful and much more influential China in the world? So I guess you could say I'm looking at it from a Westerner's perspective, but actually I also try in my book to step outside my Westerness, and I try my best. It's always hard to leave your own culture, but I try to also understand how China might look at these questions. And I also try to look at how do third countries. So if you're a Kazakhstan, or if you're a Thailand or an Indonesia, if you're one of these other countries that doesn't always fit the stereotype of West or East, but actually if you're one of the many, many countries in between that are non-aligned, or who might be looking at finding a way to benefit from the rise of China and not always looking at China as a threat, as some Western countries do. I have tried in this book to get my head around how can different countries, different actors manage risks. And so it's not a classic Western approach, but it is, of course, written by a Westerner. At the end of the day, I'm a product of my own culture and my own country. And perhaps my strongest voice, therefore, is perhaps to my fellow Westerners that, look, just take a breath, figure out ways to manage risks ahead. There will be risks ahead in the much more complex world that we're heading into, but I hope to remain an optimist that we can find ways to manage those risks.
Look, there's one part of your argument that I found particularly interesting, and perhaps it's the fact that you've been able to step outside, in a sense, of an embedded Western starting point, and be mindful of the fact that you're bringing something to the table. And that is the argument that Western geopolitical thinking has tended to anchor this question of risk in a zero-sum logic, whereby risk becomes a black and white conflict driving question, a zero-sum logic, catastrophe, whereas your interviews seem to suggest that there needs to be a different sensibility to this broad issue of risk.
Yes, indeed. I think, and this is one of the things that struck me around 2017, when the whole narrative in the West was changing. As an Australian, I had worked as an Australian diplomat, as an Australian political advisor and trade official, and Australia had, up until those years, had always been aware of risks, risk management, but the overarching narrative in Australia, at least amongst those perhaps you could call them elite circles, the people who operated in international business or who worked in the world of international relations, the general view had been that from Australia's perspective, Australia needed to be embedded in the Asia-Pacific region, and that Asia offered Australia this enormous opportunity for prosperity from Asia's growth generally, and this is not China alone, but Asia generally, its development brings this huge economic opportunity to Australia, but also Australia as a migrant country also has the potential to build people-to-people and cultural links into Asia that it didn't have in its first 2 centuries. In fact, Australia in its colonial period actively tried to resist having any relationships at all with Asia. But in the 20th century and into the early 21st century, there was opportunity So the overarching elite view, at least, even if it wasn't shared by everyone, but the elite view would have been that there are enormous opportunities and there are some risks to be managed. But it all changed. And so, as you say, Warwick, that overarching Western narrative, which has become very black and white, that if you are engaging, that you're facing mortal threats. That began, I believe, around 2017. It wasn't only because of Donald Trump, because it clearly became bipartisan in the United States, because we've seen a continuation of it, and we saw a very rapid pivot, if you like, from America's focus on the war on terror in the Middle East to seeing the China strategic competition as the big issue for the United States. It was almost as if people in the United States hadn't really taken China very seriously until the global financial crisis and until that period into the second decade of this century. And so I do think I'm an optimist about Australia. I do think Australia being in the region, and New Zealand as well for that matter, may well be Western countries, but they're countries where you can have a little bit more of a complex conversation about these questions, that there are opportunities as well as risks. But the change in the Western narrative seems to have really been very successful. It demonstrates, I think, the soft power of the Western narrative, that at least within the West, that it has held very firmly. And of course, some events have reinforced that as well. I think there's no doubt. I was living and writing my PhD in Europe, and there's no doubt that the war in Ukraine has deepened and reinforced that Western narrative of black versus white, a geopolitical threat narrative. And there's no doubt that in the minds of Europeans, especially, that Russia and China have become conflated, have gotten mixed up together, which for those of us who know those particular countries and know just how vastly different they are, unfortunately, it's a bit simplistic. But there's no doubt, I think, that Western narrative is very locked in. And so those of us who want to probe it and who want to suggest to people that life is a bit more complex, that it isn't just black and white, and that we're going to have to find a way to live together, and we are going to have to build an international system that engages with China and doesn't just see China as a threat. We have our work cut out for us, because the power of that threat narrative is very strong indeed.
So, if this idea of risk has been conflated with the idea of threat and catastrophe, you're also arguing, of course, that there needs to be a different posture towards this question of risk. Could you give us a bit of a quick tour, if you will, of David Morris's particular take on how we need to rethink the question of risk and to de-catastrophize it, and bring it back into this new frame that you're working us towards?
I must admit that I was very disappointed with the academic discourse. So when I threw myself into writing the book and into doing the PhD, I found that so much of the literature that I read was really rather simplistic, and so I have leaned back towards my professional training as a diplomat, and also my professional career experience of working quite a lot. I've had the great good fortune of working quite a lot with international businesses, with successful international businesses. And in my experience, what a diplomat does, or what an international business does as well, when you go into another country and you embed yourself in another country. So as a diplomat, you serve there for a few years, you become the expert on that country. You have to provide advice back to your capital. Your advice is pretty useless if it's just black and white. If it is just saying, well, this country is a threat to us, and we've got to prepare for war. Well, that would be absolutely nonsensical in 99% of scenarios. Now, of course, in a worst case scenario, that may well be the case. But for most of the time, in most places in the world, the role of a diplomat is actually to assess the complexity, to actually understand the way the other side sees things, and to build relationships so that actually you find ways to negotiate and to find common ground with even a very different culture. And for an international business, it's not so different. For an international business, when you invest, establish your operations in a very different culture, you have to learn to understand that culture. You have to learn to joint venture or to find your way around government regulations and the way that your customers are going to respond to your products or your services. You have to have an open mind to adjust and to find it's a constant process of negotiation, of learning, of adjusting. And that's exactly how in the days of the post-Cold War, in the very positive days of globalization and global interdependence, this is actually how most people operating in the real world of international relations or international business, this is the way they operate. They, on a daily basis, they are scanning the environment. Where are the opportunities? Where are the risks? How do we seize those opportunities? How do we manage the risks? How do we avoid any catastrophe, and how do we actually find ways to manage risk? So that's how I think risk has to be understood. That risk is simply, it's part of the landscape that we need to be assessing all the time. We need to be doing scenario planning, and that does not mean just a worst case scenario. Of course, we might want to do that as a nation. We have a national security imperative in every nation state on earth. We, of course, have to map out what is our worst case scenario, but we also have to work out how realistic is that and what are the things that would lead us towards that, and how do we avoid the worst case scenario. So we actually need to put a lot of our effort, I believe, into looking at all of the other scenarios that are not the worst case, but are actually somewhere in the middle. That doesn't mean Pollyanna, it doesn't mean perfection, it doesn't mean harmony and heaven on earth. It means looking at what are the actual practical risks, what are the actual issues going on, what are the things that we need to assess and that we need to understand. So it's a practical approach, I hope, to be bringing in this book, and hope to be encouraging. I mean, for example, when I looked at the Belt and Road and looked at all of the projects across the Belt and Road, I took a bit of a look at that Sri Lanka port that had, in the Western narrative, had become very famous, supposedly this Chinese debt trap. And, I was interviewing a World Bank specialist and about that project. And he said to me, it's probably one of the best case examples of where a country that was mismanaging the project itself, Sri Lanka was poorly mismanaging its debt and that particular project, and where they actually came up with quite a good deal with Chinese finance to ensure that the port could be built, the project could go ahead. He thought actually it was a pretty gold class deal that was done. So when you talk to people on the ground, when you go and investigate on the ground what's actually happening rather than the academic threat discourse, you find that it's a lot more complex. And there were examples on the Belt and Road of projects that have not worked so well, but there were examples of projects that have worked very well. And in between, lots of projects where risks had not always been managed so well by the local governments. Quite often, countries have got themselves into too much debt, especially since COVID. And that's not necessarily because of the funding source, but rather the local conditions on the ground. So understanding complexity, I think, helps us to comprehend that risk is about complexity. Risk is about uncertainty. It's not black and white. It is very rarely black and white.
The book, A New Era of Risk, of course, is available at all good bookstores, as they say, and there will be details in the description below. But I guess I'd just like to drill in a little bit on what are the sort of main constituent parts of the risk profile, if you will, as you see it, based on the interviews that you've done, and how this broad cross-section of business people, together with government officials and others, actually view the landscape, as opposed to necessarily falling into the trap of that simplistic black and white narrative frame.
Well, I looked at three particular areas. One was this question of international finance, because I think that's one of the areas in which the rise of China has sent a shockwave through the United States. I think the US genuinely had not really noticed until after the global financial crisis, and until perhaps even the first couple of years of the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think many people in the US were really watching, and so the role of China in international finance has now become noticed, and of course there has been that geopolitical assessment of it, and so drilling down into how international finance is operating, in particular looking at a case study which I call my best case study, because I think the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is widely misunderstood in the general public, because in the general public, and I would have been the same years ago before I spent so much time researching these questions, most people don't know much about these big multilateral development banks. But the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China created, the first big multilateral new financial institution that China created, it's headquartered in Beijing. It was fiercely resisted by the United States, but it's been a world-class example of a very effectively well-managed, well-operated financial institution that is funding very serious, very, very useful development projects around the world, including in India and in Indonesia and Bangladesh and all over the place. So that was my best case. And so by looking at a best case, I think it's useful because it does underline my argument that things are more complex, and the black and white approach just doesn't make sense if there are best case examples, and that certainly is. I also looked at technology, and I looked at the whole question of Chinese leadership in many new fields of technology, and this, of course, is also perceived in the West and particularly in the United States, as a competitive threat to the United States leadership in technology, and I think. I think it's understandable, actually, because technological leadership has always been fundamental to great powers in the world order of the day. It was certainly the case with the British Empire had a technological advantage. There's no doubt in the 20th century that the United States had a technological advantage over other countries. And so the very rapid rise of Chinese technological capabilities, and we've seen AI in recent times, we've seen drone technology, quantum computing, and all the rest of it. I look specifically at the question of Huawei and the 5G capabilities, where really I think China shocked the world by being so far ahead in 5G wireless technology, and of course leading us in towards 6G in the coming years, which allows this enormous change in manufacturing. In the move to smart manufacturing is underpinned by the move to driverless cars, and all of these technologies of the future is underpinned by this. So China is in the box seat. China's in a very powerful position now with these technologies. It will be seen as a competitive threat, but does it have to be a real threat? Was my question. And it's complicated because, of course, technologies can always be utilised. They can be securitized and can be weaponized. So it comes down to, how do countries act? Do countries take control of technologies and use them against other countries, or can technology be harnessed for the common good? And so my simple answer, and it's much more complicated, it's the longest chapter of the book, but my simple answer is that it can be done, even at the depths of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. We had very deep and practical and successful cooperation on new technologies of the day, such as, for example, nuclear power. There was a UN agency created, International Atomic Energy Agency. There were rules and norms and standards. And so around the whole question of nuclear proliferation and nuclear energy, there was enormous cooperation. And there were one or two breakout problems. There were a few problems that occurred, but they weren't caused by the US or the Soviet Union, the problems that occurred with that regime. So it was an example of where even strategic competitors can actually develop rules and can develop an approach to new technologies to keep us safe. And this is my strong argument on AI and on all of the new technologies that we are seeing rolled out in the next decade. These could be very unsafe technologies if they're not governed, if we don't have rules, indeed, if we don't have international institutions to govern them. And so at the moment, what we see is an inability for the US and China to really cooperate in these areas, and we're going to need to find a way for them to do so. And thirdly, my worst case scenario that I looked at was actually where you have total government collapse, where you have failed states. And so I looked at the example of Myanmar as a place in crisis, into complete crisis on so many levels, from civil war to the natural disasters to just the dysfunction of Myanmar. It's right on the border of China, and so some of Myanmar's dysfunction spills across into China, with causing all kinds of problems for China itself. And so, as a worst case example, I guess you could expect, if you were looking at this through the geopolitical lens, you might expect China to go in and to intervene and to put Myanmar into a position in which it needed to follow the direction of China. You might expect that China might militarize the port that a Chinese company, CITIC, is developing at Jiaopu in the Rakhine state, for example. Now, those expectations might well be worst case expectations, but I think when we look at other great powers and how great powers have operated in troublesome regions close to their borders, usually big powers do intervene in other countries. And the interesting thing about Myanmar is here that China is taking quite an active role in trying to play some peacemaking role, but I think it's very difficult to do so. And China is taking a different approach than the West, in that it continues to engage with a largely dysfunctional and discredited regime in Myanmar, but China talks to both sides. China engages with both sides in Myanmar and continues to invest. So China sees its interests in stability. I think China would prefer to see a peaceful Myanmar and a Myanmar that was economically developing, and not one that had been driven into such dysfunction as it has been by the military in Myanmar. So even as a worst case, we see that the environment is more complex than the simplistic pictures that are painted. So again, it just underlines my argument that in all of these places, yes, of course there are risks. In technology, of course there are risks. In places like Myanmar, of course there are risks. It all comes down to how do we as an international community manage those risks, and how is China managing those risks? And China to date actually is operating as you would expect a great power to do. It is creating new institutions, new rules. It is developing new standards and new approaches, and we ought to look at those approaches objectively and carefully, because we just might want to work with them. We just might want to find ways that the whole international community can actually engage with China and make its new initiatives mutually beneficial.
Where do you think China draws its inspiration from in terms of trying to frame a non-catastrophized approach to risk management and ultimately resolution? So when it's been catastrophized, the typical response has to be, of course, you must go in with all guns blazing, so to speak, because it's bad versus good. But once it's non-catastrophized or decatastrophized and it's more grey, then the approach is entirely different. So, where does China draw its inspiration from?
Well, I think this is one of the very interesting things when you read the international relations literature, just how little intercultural understanding there actually is. So, most of the Western international relations literature assumes that China will act just like a Western power. And so it assumes that China, as a rising power, will act in the way that rising powers from Europe have acted in the past. And so this seems to me to be a central problem that people outside of China are not comprehending that actually Chinese people and the Chinese government and other Chinese actors actually see the world in quite a different way and are therefore likely to uh, look at risk differently, because within China, and not just China alone, but we could generalize about East Asian cultures as a whole. There's a very different concept of diversity, of complexity, of uncertainty. Whereas in the Western way of thinking, things are black and white. We can scientifically measure things, and political scientists imagine that they can scientifically measure what is happening in international relations. I would say actually that the world is much more complex, just as the Asian way of thinking tells us, and so we in the West could learn a lot from actually trying to expand our minds, expand our way of thinking to understand complexity. If you get it, if you get the whole concept of complexity and diversity, then you are able to think about risk in a very different way. You're able to actually scenario plan in a very different way than if you have a simplistic black and white approach. And look, here again, perhaps I'm being optimistic about Australia and New Zealand, but I do think that Australia and New Zealand, as very multicultural societies, is very successful, relatively successful compared with other places, successful multicultural societies. It means that actually many of us, not everyone, but many of us actually have learnt to understand diversity and to understand complexity and intercultural communication, the importance of actually accepting that someone might see things in a different way. This is just pretty simple stuff. But when it comes to the United States and China, we could do with a bit more of it. Just a simple understanding that, hey, those guys over there see the world differently. Certainly Americans see the world very differently as well. And so just being able to get ourselves into their heads helps us enormously to do the scenario planning that we need for a very uncertain future.
I wanted to pick your brains a little bit more on this question of an Asian sensibility, because you mentioned that it's not just a Chinese sensibility, but an East Asian sensibility in a broader sense. What are the sort of common threads of that sensibility that you believe are important? And I guess I want to drill in a little bit more on that general theme of diversity and complexity. What is it about that Asian or East Asian sensibility that frames these questions differently and enables these cultures to build institutions that address these issues in a different way?
Well, I think when it comes to international relations, we must never forget that for most of the countries of the Asian region, and actually for many countries in the world, those foundation principles of the Bandung Conference in 1955 are absolutely central to the way that international practitioners think. So if you are a diplomat from Indonesia, or if you're a business person from Singapore, or anyone from the region, uh, those principles are central to the way that you see the world. And it is alarming to me how many people in the West don't know what I'm talking about when I mention the Bandung principles. And I am not going to remember them all, but the central concept that countries should not interfere in each other's domestic politics, for a start, that every country has the right to self-determination and to managing its own affairs, which of course came from the period of decolonisation. And so this non-interference in each other's affairs is fundamental to the countries of ASEAN, countries of Southeast Asia. It is a fundamental principle that they believe in. Now, in the Western logic, this is seen as some kind of a weakness. This is seen as some kind of an amoral position, because in the West there is an imagination that it is a much more moral position to take, to condemn certain countries for certain things. But of course, as we all know, people may well feel and believe very strongly in those moral positions they take, but more often than not, there are double standards that operate. More often than not, people are outraged about one thing, but turn a blind eye to something else that might be actually comparable in any sort of moral equation. And so I tend to think that in international relations, morality is a very difficult area. It might make a lot more sense for us to actually adopt those principles of non-interference in each other's affairs. Of course, where we affect each other, where we are influencing each other and where we must work together, we have to negotiate and we have to take positions on all kinds of issues. And just as businesses have to deal with all kinds of issues as well. But taking a moral stand is a problematical question most of the time. However, of course, there will be extremes, and there will be examples where I would argue we do ultimately still have to take a moral stand in a very clear position. But I think that that's part of the difference, is that just the foundation point of the Western thinking is that we're good and moral and other actors are not as moral as we are, and therefore we're going to judge them. I think that's problematical most of the time. And the position that a country that aspires to those Bandung principles, a country that aspires to non-interference in other countries, mutual respect between nations, that's a very different approach. They don't have to be in competition with each other. I think the Western view is always going to probably take moral positions on things, but it could well be a workable way forward for countries of the West to not so actively be interfering in other countries' business as well. And we might even be seeing a move in that direction in the Trump period, for example. He's certainly interfering with our interests with his protectionist trade policy, but he seems to be saying, and it's hard to know so far just how consistent he will be, but Trump seems to be saying that the United States is going to pull back from interfering in other countries. So that will be very interesting indeed. It means that there might not be a clash here, but just a different way of thinking, and maybe we can find a way through where the complexity of the world is just better understood.
I mean, this sort of brings us to the crucible, if you will, which is where I've been hoping to really put you on the spot, so to speak, and that goes to the present moment, and it is that tension point between the United States of America and China, obviously as the trade war has unfolded in particular. And how would you firstly frame that this moment? How would you sort of come to understand it through your framework? And secondly, and this is I guess where it becomes a little bit of a challenge, but what is it that you would say to the folk involved that may help them think through the moment and perhaps see a pathway to the other side?
Well, the second part of that question is a very difficult one indeed, because I think what is happening is that the leadership in the United States on both sides of politics has shifted away from what had been pretty much a consensus position. And that was a consensus around interdependence, global interdependence. And the consensus that America had around a world order that was based on the multilateral system, the United Nations system, the World Trade Organization, it was based on an optimism that America would maintain its position as the leading country in that system. And therefore, as a great power, perhaps at times could even diverge from that system when its interests were in play. But largely, there was a consensus around that world order that we have come to know in the post-Cold War era. There was, until probably 9/11, enormous optimism about the potential for a new world order that would be more rules based, and that was broadly a consensus, I think, in not just in the United States, but certainly it was very actively and passionately supported by most other Western countries around the rest of the world, including, for example, Australia was a country that was very optimistic in the 1990s, in the post-Cold War era, about building a system of global interdependence in which countries could develop and we could see greater prosperity, but also that we could find through interdependence that we'd build habits. My old boss, Gareth Evans, the former Australian foreign minister, used to call about habits of dialogue, he used to say. He used to talk about these habits of dialogue, that we would actually develop a new approach to engaging with each other and understanding each other. That optimism has gone in the United States, and I think also in large part in Europe as well in recent years. And it's been this mighty combination, a perfect storm of many different things. It's not just about China, but I think China's part of it. I think the fact that China now is a peer competitor to the United States is part of the equation. I think the United States in particular has just lost faith in that order. If it cannot be the ruling country in that order, it certainly is not going to support the continuation of that world order. I think that there is a belief in the United States that the World Trade Organization, that the idea of a rules-based trading system has not worked for them, and it certainly hasn't, because they were obviously buying far too much from the rest of the world and not exporting enough, and so they've been running these huge trade deficits. And so if you're going to measure your success by whether you have a surplus or a deficit of trade, which is far too simplistic actually, but if you are going to measure it that way, well then of course it's been easy for populist politicians to say this system is broken and we need to change it. So I think that's the problem, that the confidence that people had in interdependence, the confidence people had in America and in Europe in a rules-based system has broken down. And so, of course, we mentioned already the war in Europe. I think that also has reinforced this concern in the West that the rules-based system that we thought we were building has broken down. Now, of course, there have been other wars. And so actually the system has never worked perfectly. And so how do you come back from this? Can you bring the United States back into a philosophy of interdependence with the rest of the world if China's going to be the leading player, the leading trade player in the world, and with a rising India and Vietnam and Indonesia and other countries as well? Can you actually embed the United States in a system where you have a rules-based, multilateral, interdependent system? Well, I would hope so, but I don't think there's an easy answer to that at the moment. I think we're moving through a rocky period where the US elites on both sides have lost confidence. They just don't have trust that system can work in their interests. And there's this other dimension to American power, and perhaps this is not a criticism, by the way. It's perhaps it's a dimension of any great power, that there can be this temptation to go it alone, or to simply tear down a system that isn't working for you and try and rebuild a new one, the US is still a very powerful country. So they probably do have enormous capacity to try and influence the way the new trading order in particular shapes out. The geopolitical order is another question altogether. But I think uncertainty is actually the theme of our times. We just don't know how this is going to shake out, and could we influence the Donald Trumps of the day and his equivalents in Europe? And when I say equivalents, I don't mean that they have to share his politics, but just the people who've decided that interdependence cannot work, and that's quite a strong consensus in the US and Europe today, I believe. Can we influence today's generation? I don't know. I think it might be a question of a future generation of leaders who will need to be convinced. They're going to need to be convinced by China. China's got a big job to do here to convince the world that as it rises further, as it will, I mean, it's obviously China's growth is slower than it has been for the last few decades, but China will inevitably continue to be a big player. And so I think from a Western perspective, China is going to need to demonstrate that this rise is peaceful and that this rise is mutually beneficial, that all of the cards aren't going to be held by China. I think if the next generation of decision makers can see that there's mutual benefit and there's peaceful cooperation, then absolutely there's the potential to convince another generation that interdependence can work. Because what's the alternative to interdependence? The alternative is conflict, and it's constant competition, zero-sum competition at the end of the day. If both sides decide that the other side cannot be trusted, then you do head yourself back into a disaster scenario. And this is not the Cold War where really they were two separate economies, but this is a world in which the world is deeply integrated. So do we really want to tear all of that down? I don't think most of us do.
So this really goes to the heart of the subtitle of your book, really, which is the Sustainable Internationalism. And I just wanted to end with, I guess, a thought bubble that I'd ask you to respond to, and that is that sustainable internationalism as a descriptor, if it's to come into action, really needs to be mobilized around new habits of dialogue. So one's the action point and the other one is sort of a description of a state. Any thoughts on that as a way of concluding this sort of navigation through your research, your concerns and your discoveries that hopefully will help shape thinking towards a more peaceful world?
Yeah, I think, look, we're in such a period of rapid change, and it's almost difficult to comprehend just how much technology is going to change the shape of economies and will change societies, I think, in future, because the technologies to come are really transformational. And of course, we have climate change, which again is difficult for us to imagine because it's happening so slowly, but it's happening. We're seeing more and more natural disasters. We're seeing the melting of the ice caps. And so while those of us who've been around a long time can say, oh, well, it's a very slow process, and so it's easy for me to say, but if you ask an 18-year-old, almost anywhere in the world. I mean, I've just been in Bangladesh recently talking to some very talented young people there, and I imagined that they would be totally focused on their own domestic challenges. But, they all said to me their number one concern is climate change. Number one concern, even in a place that's facing all kinds of other political and economic problems. Climate change and technology, these big changes to come, simply require us. Those of us who have the capacity to think differently, we simply have to start thinking about a new international cooperation approach. This simplistic, they're all baddies and we're all goodies approach doesn't solve climate change. It simply gives you a leave pass. It allows you to walk away and say, oh, well, because those baddies over there won't do anything, we won't either. Actually, the only way to solve these problems, the only way to solve climate change, the only way to regulate and benefit from these new technologies is going to be if we can get these big countries in particular to cooperate and build rules and actions, and to roll out as many of those electric vehicles as we possibly can. It's putting up barriers against them is simply trying to hold back the flood. What we actually need is the green economy solutions. We actually need the technological solutions. So a sustainable internationalism will be a change in mindset. It will be a mindset, it would have to be a mindset that the problems the world is facing are bigger than individual countries, and the only way individual countries can prosper and solve our problems is if we internationally collaborate. Many of us already know this. We already know from globalization that we're much better off if we trade than if we try and put up big trade barriers and just produce everything ourselves. I know that I'm no good at doing my electrics here in my apartment, so I bring an electrician in. But equally, I can do something else. So each of us has what we're good at. Just got to find a way to collaborate. So sustainable internationalism is trying to grapple with that the urgency of the fact that actually there are big common ground issues where good leadership, wise leadership, would be trying to build coalitions of common ground, and it's just going to require a bit of a change in mindset. But I think, talk to young people, that change in mindset is coming.
Well, on that note, we might bring this conversation to an end. I'd like to thank you again, David, for your time. David Morris is an ambassador of the Habits of Dialogue. It's been a tour de force, and I would strongly recommend or highly recommend, in fact, both strongly and highly recommend, that you go out and grab a copy of New Era of Risks by David Morris to help understand what's going on in our world and to chart a way forward. Thanks again, David.
Thank you, Warwick.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.